Welcome. Thanks for coming. The timing of the panel actually worked out well because we're going to go a little deeper into the same concepts, talking about building a modern network, and that's one that's both optimized to support cloud applications or really to support user access to the tools that they need, but without making any kind of a compromise of security, regardless of where that user happens to be working. I'm Brent Baker. I am a senior sales engineer with. See, it's on here. It's correct. So I thought about that when I came in. Look. More. See, all of my coworkers are late. So, anyways, we are both sales engineers with CBTS. We work primarily on our cloud networking and UCaaS products, and that is really what we're going to go through today. Just quick note on us, I feel like everyone here is local, or at least most of you are local, and you know who CBTS is. What I do find that kind of gets lost a little bit with Cincinnati-based organizations is how big our reach is now. So we have 27 offices across the US and Canada, brick and mortar offices that, well, people used to go there. I don't know how often we actually go now.
It's an Amber Alert.
Okay.
Anyone have a Saturn view?
Good. I remember what I was saying. Anyways, while we're looking for the Saturn view, we have 27 offices, but we really have a global customer base. And I might be biased because I work in our cloud networking and SD-WAN team, but I really feel that a lot of that has been driven by the growth of our SD-WAN practice, because we can now partner with a regionally based organization, but we can support their infrastructure around the world. And SD-WAN has really allowed us to do that efficiently and successfully for them. We're really focused on what we call strategic services, right? So we start by taking, handpicking some best of breed OEMs. And you'll notice that we've got a lot of different, maybe verticals is the right term or not, but we have some handpicked networking partners. We've got some handpicked security partners. We've got handpicked UCaaS partners. And we take those platforms and put our own service provider wrapper around it. On the previous slide, we talked about, hey, we have about 2,500 employees. Well, we also have, those 2,700 employees, carry about 3,000 certifications, right? We're an engineering-heavy company. We incentivize them to get certified. We want our staff to be the best at supporting whatever OEM point solution we've picked. And we'll use that to build these as a service offerings. So, maybe that's UCaaS, maybe that's contact center, maybe that's SD-WAN and SASE, or increasingly that is now security services such as MDR, EDR, SIM, just and the like. And finally on that, we do continuously pay attention to the market, try to identify who is that next best of breed OEM that we're going to be on here. I'll make a special call out to Cato, since one of my partners from the panel has come from Cato. So I think they'll be in there soon. That's the rumor anyways. We call this our 5 pillars of service. Just a little bit more detail on kind of what does that all actually mean. We do a lot with Microsoft. We can do anything with Teams. We can do anything with Azure. We can be a CSP. I think we're the best UCaaS provider in the country, right? We're quasi-vendor agnostic, right? I'm not going to come up here and say that Zoom is the best or RingCentral is the best because I don't work for them. I work for a service provider. We pick the best solution based on the customer's need out of the options that we have, those world-class OEMs that we've chosen. And kind of finally here, the core of what we're talking about today, network as a service. This is what you would call traditional infrastructure. We're going to talk about that as the network plumbing, but this is taking the wire that you need to connect to your buildings and your access points and moving that into a cloud-based consumption model. We've got multiple platforms available for SD-WAN and SASE. You know, I think everyone can recognize that both those tools are important and useful for just about every organization. But, you know, there's no point solution that's right for everybody. We offer everybody up there and maybe a few more. You know, we'll be vendor agnostic in matching the right point solution to your specific needs. And we're going to back all of that with security. Right? The network team and the security team used to be separate things. They need to be the same thing. And you know, you need to build security into your networking solution, your remote access solution. And you know, you also need someone watching the alerts. You need to incorporate a SOC into that. You can spend tons of money on a great security point solution, but if the alert fires at 1 o'clock in the morning and nobody's there to read it, then you haven't actually secured anything. Any questions on CBTS so far? Does anyone need a refresher on how to pronounce SASE? All right, so I'm going to turn it over to Kevin here for a second. I don't really know how we're going to do this mic thing because we've only got one. Just try that.
All right, there it is. Hi, like Brent said, sales engineer at CBTS. I used to actually run our network install team for these cloud networking solutions. So it's kind of cool for me to be able to get more customer facing as a sales engineer, kind of in the role that I have today, because I got to see a lot of these migrations that people are going through, like see where they're at, help them move to something new. And that's kind of part of the building of stuff is what I used to do up until pretty recently. So the things that I'm kind of going to walk through here, like the journey that we're starting to see a lot of people go down, is the thing that I've kind of got to talk through with people and help see them go through. So I got a lot of folks that started here, right? Dark days of command line. And the point about the networking here, inflexible, it's really inflexible infrastructure that gets users to resources, right? As long as the network is on, as long as the plumbing is flowing, like the pipes are moving data.
How many CCNAs do we have in here? Any? Right? How often do you still touch a CLI?
Yes,
Every day?
Yes.
Every day, yesterday?
Happy though, like you enjoy spending all day troubleshooting via command line? Or at least do you find it efficient?
I find it very efficient. And then I cut my teeth on Unix. Actually, I cut it on fax a long time ago.
How efficient are, say, 25-year-old help desk people at it?
Yeah.
Yeah, so.
That discussion's been had several times.
I used to feel that I was really, really fast at CLI, but I haven't touched it
Yeah.
in 2 years. I don't know about you.
I still jump into it time to time, but it's because I used to work. I was an engineer, and so the folks that do the engineering now, they still come to me and they say, "Hey, can you tell me how to go do this thing?" And I say, "I can, but man, I wish you guys would learn."
What it is if I use something like Ansible instead of doing it, right? I use a tool to do it, but it's still a command line tool.
Yeah, but you're using computers to machines to configure other machines,
Oh yeah.
right? Like I can do this once and it can configure my own network.
Well, if you have to do it more than once, you better be looking at automating anyway.
Exactly. Which feeds into Kevin's.
Exactly, and that's just where we're going. So the old version of command line, the CCNA version of command line, where we start, right? And where I have a lot of people that start that conversation with me because they say, "I've got all this infrastructure that is existing and running, and I don't have the people that still work in that space or live in that space to support it." So we go from inflexible infrastructure to dashboards everywhere, right? Everything has a dashboard that comes with it. And I see a lot of folks that are kind of going down that NaaS migration, right, where we go from, and here's just a couple examples, different dashboards that we see out there, whether it's Meraki or Checkpoint or Palo or whatever it is. The infrastructure, the user interface gets more flexible. It gives me tons more, it pushes more data in front of me that I don't have to ask it in the same way. I don't have to have the technical knowledge to go into CLI and ask for answers the way that maybe this might present it to me in something that's, somebody less than a CCNA can kind of get in and interact with, right? I can go through and It can send me a Teams message. It can send me a WebEx message, a text message, an email if there's something that's up or down, kind of basics around health of the network. But at its core, at that level still, what I still see is generally plumbing. It's more flexible. It's more colorful. If any of you do home repair, you hopefully recognize PEX plumbing, right? Anybody that's kind of gone down this road too? Because some of us are engineers and we still like get our hands dirty with like real stuff. But it still is plumbing, because most of that network as a service is still just focused on passing data. How do I get my end user from my access point to the application? Whether that's in my data center, a SaaS application, in my cloud, in somebody else, whatever it is, it's still just largely plumbing, getting people to resources. And I think that that's, in some ways, great. You know, for me as a managed service provider, I can install network anywhere now using hands and feet technicians, because I've got a couple guys that can do the cloud networking piece. I don't need a CCIE, a CCNA, a CCNP, somebody boots on the ground, console into a device. I can do a lot of that remotely, and I can do it automated. So, you know, we had a customer we were rolling out where we were building, you know, 300 or 400 networks a week, but we were doing it with a couple scripts. We were letting the robots do the work. Robots were doing the building, and then we had hands and feet technicians that were just going in and plugging in cables.
Hey, Kevin, can we talk about that 300 a week? We don't need to name names of who it was, but like, how big was that in total?
Can we name names? So that
Okay.
We were.
Our boss's boss just said to name names. So.
Yeah. So I was running our install team when we were doing installs for Lids and for Claire's. And Lids is about 1,000 sites across North America. Claire's is 3,000. The farthest east they went was Poland, and then through Hawaii. Right. So international customers. And we would run a script on Sunday night that would prep the build for all the sites that were going to go live, that were going to be shipped from our warehouse, because we staged them, shipped them, and then sent them out to wherever they were going to go. And we had people that were installing these. Sometimes it was store managers. If we couldn't get a tech on site, the instructions were so easy that by the time the hardware arrived, all we had to do was plug and play. When you move to that cloud networking, when you move your control plane and some of that management plane to the cloud, you get more flexibility in how you build, design, configure, and implement your plumbing. And if you're a plumber, that's great. But I think a lot of folks are starting to say, that's awesome, right? Like we've revolutionized plumbing. We went from copper pipes to PEX plumbing. But I'd kind of like my plumbing to do more. I don't think the idea of moving all of that infrastructure to the cloud, all of that control plane to the cloud, great, but now that it's there, what else can it do? You know, I'd like it to do more than send me a Teams message when an access point goes down. Because there's a lot of stuff that it doesn't do. It doesn't tell me if my pipes are leaking, right? Like, it doesn't tell me anything, and what I mean by that is it doesn't tell me about end user experience, about water flow or water pressure, right? If I have customers that started out with us, and we started with a Wi-Fi survey because they were having problems in their warehouse, cold storage warehouse, right? So big metal walls, big freezers everywhere. You can imagine the Wi-Fi scanning guns probably were less than optimal. And tongue in cheek, obviously, they were doing a terrible job. But they didn't have, even though they were looking at cloud networking, they didn't have information about end user experience from that IoT device. So even though the network was up, the access point was on, the device was connected, there's still user experience. You know, there was so much data leakage, there was so much information that was not passing the way we expected it to. Other things that my plumbing network doesn't do for me is it doesn't tell me if somebody's using it safely or securely. So for example, I've got little kids, 5 and 8, and dear goodness, I do want them to wash their hands every time they use the restroom. But my plumbing doesn't tell me if they're screwing around and they accidentally turn on the hot water instead of the cold. It doesn't keep them safe from bad choices. And my network, it doesn't, for a lot of folks that move to the cloud, it doesn't natively do that for you anyway either. It doesn't make your end users more secure, it just moves your management. And when Brent and I started putting this together was a month or two ago when it was kind of the holiday season, right? And in my house, like those holiday season movies last through January. So like the Home Alone scene where the bad guys are in the house stuffing paper towels into the sink and turning them on before they leave. My network doesn't tell me who's using it when I'm not looking. My plumbing doesn't tell me if somebody's turned a faucet on when I'm not home, but man, I would like to know that, and I'd like to know that about my plumbing too. I'd like to know when there's people that are using it that I don't think are using it, or when it's not expected for them to use it. What I need is, I need a network that is identity aware, that is context aware, and that we build rules into our network, or in our secure networks, that are focused on the identity and the application and how people are using that network, rather than treating them as a separate entity from just the plumbing, right? Security and networking can't be different things. We have to build those into a unified platform, because just keeping the plumbing working only gets us so far. So, pause for a second, because that's all of that kind of leads us to a point that you say, okay, so all of that plumbing though is inside my house, or it's inside my business. I've got all that plumbing, all that infrastructure that I can manage, and maybe I can do things in that world where I can put controls around my access points, or I can put controls around, when somebody plugs in a cable, like what does that look like? But I think we're all probably, the fact that we're all sitting here at a work event in a conference room with mobile devices in front of us tells us that our plumbing extends beyond our network, right? Like we all know, we live in that world, nothing new. We all have an edge that actually looks a lot like this today, or some portion of this network edge. Do you guys, anybody know, just curious, any guesses what that is a picture of? Ooh, interesting guess. Anybody else? I used to teach high school too, so I have no problem cold calling people, especially people that look away. It's all your network edge. A lot of you guys have people that live and work there all day long.
Starbucks.
Look at that guy. Did you see this before?
No.
He's not even a plant. So, like, that network edge, my plumbing isn't even my plumbing, right? It's somebody else's network with maybe somebody else's device, but I have users that are out there in the world that still need to access my applications, whether it's mine in a SaaS cloud, mine in a data center, mine in my data center, or somebody else's, whatever it is. And that's the problem that we're starting to run into, so that we've done this, we've moved through this kind of NaaS migration, and we see and talk about it a lot at things like this. We talk about NaaS and we talk about SD-WAN, these kind of new plumbing infrastructures. But the question is, now that we've got a lot of folks that are working through that migration, how do we look at that solution and build security into it so that it's native? Because it has to be more than just cloud plumbing. We need to get to a point where we can upskill that plumbing, right? And a lot of us are going through, we mentioned Ansible earlier, right? Our IT people are going through an upskilling process where we are learning coding, we're learning these things, and Brent and I at CBTS, a lot of folks that we work with are going through that same thing. When we started building a new team around our networking, cloud networking and NaaS solution, the minimum requirement was not a CCNA. The minimum requirement is coding. We're upskilling our engineering team and our engineering talent, and we kind of need our network to do that too. We need to upskill that NaaS network, or those SD-WAN networks, so that they can join our security team. They need to be part of our SOC. They need to be part of the security suite. They need to be part of the same infrastructure, the same teams that build and manage that. So I've painted a bleak picture, because we're starting to talk about security, right? And it's got to be always a bleak picture when you start to get into security. The problems are everywhere. The threats are everywhere. I'm going to let Brent kind of talk a little bit through where we go from here. Let me hand you the microphone back, too, that doesn't do any microphoning.
All right, so let's get into the nuts and bolts a little bit of exactly how we fix the Starbucks problem, or at least we fix the issue of needing our networks to be more than just plumbing and needing security as part of everything that we do. So starting kind of just, where we are now, or at least where we were, what we'll call traditional network as a service, really it's traditional networking. And in that case, we are talking about the plumbing that is really just connecting buildings to other buildings. In our case, our as-a-service product was mostly built on Cisco Meraki. We've got some Juniper out there. We do, VeloCloud, SD-WAN. But look, create buildings to buildings. Everything's in my data center. My branch has a secure VPN tunnel or maybe a private circuit back to HQ. That's where all my apps are. I have this nice, safe perimeter where I can say, I've got a firewall. I don't have to worry about anything else. That was never actually true, but it's really, that's the perception. If you're in, you're good. If you're out, you're bad. The world doesn't really work like that, though, right? Like even before we all went to work at Starbucks, people started to shift. I've got things in public cloud. I'm using SaaS applications. Nobody on the planet wants to support their own Exchange server when it's so easy to buy it from Bio365 from Microsoft. So that's kind of the first crack in the perimeter. I've got stuff outside of the corporate, corporate headquarters, corporate firewall. Then let's introduce our remote user. Before COVID, we could just do VPN. It were the exception rather than the norm. And this does create a bottleneck. This does kind of create latency problems. This is mediocre at best, but that was all we needed there. Now everybody's remote. We cannot put all 2,800 CBTS employees on a VPN connection back through our one firewall. We're going to have all kinds of performance issues, and most of us aren't going to use it anyways. There is absolutely nothing telling me I can't go directly to O365. I can't go directly to a lot of public cloud apps from my endpoint. I don't even have to be using my own corporate laptop. I can do it from my phone. I can do it from my personal machine. So I am now outside of the perimeter. And we have to rethink, maybe not even rethink. Let's just forget the word perimeter. There is no perimeter. We have to look at it a different way. Not to mention, bad actors are still there. They are still going to hit your perimeter. They're going to try to compromise your end user. They're going to hit your SaaS applications. You're going to hit your public cloud. So getting past thinking about plumbing, right? We, the network team, aren't just cloud plumbers anymore. We have to have security as part of it, and we have to stop thinking about the need to connect buildings to other buildings through pipes. We got to start talking about connecting users to applications, and we've got to have that entire journey secured and monitored, and we got to think about quality of experience. We didn't care too much about remote user, whether it's voice quality or application performance issues, because again, it was the exception rather than the rule. If you have trouble making a Teams call, go to the office. That doesn't really fly for. We've got to look at solutions that have, the industry term is active digital experience management, but you need something that tells you that your remote users are having, a good experience, or I call it just as good in the office, work anywhere.
And I'll piggyback on that for a second too, because we all have a lot of users that aren't people anymore. We have sensors and IoT devices,
That's right.
temperature devices, all sorts of network connected things that will never tell you if they can't connect. They're not going to tell you if they're having a bad day or if the signal's unstable. But a user in an office or a user at home will tell you, they will complain, they will open tickets with IT and then expect that ticket to be fixed within 30 seconds. But that user will get 30, I'm being generous in the 30 seconds. We all know, like that.
Yep.
Anyone that waited 30 seconds, like that's a patient end user. They just couldn't find their phone fast enough to call the service desk. But there's the end users that may be from home and may have a complaint, but there's a whole bunch of non-people in the network too. Those IoT things that tell you if doors are open, that aren't going to open a ticket with IT. They're not going to tell you natively, and they're part of that end user experience too. We need to know if the connection to, I'll use my cold storage example too because it's relevant, right? If that internet connected temperature sensor in the cooler stops reporting data, somebody needs to know about that, and it's not going to open a ticket with IT natively. So we need a solution that will start to account for those users as well.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. So at the risk of sounding like a broken record with the content from before, the solution to this is really SASE. And I like this graphic. I'm pretty sure we stole it from Gartner, but we're kind of divided into two components. We've got one, the WAN edge, and it feels strange to call SD-WAN a traditional service at this point, but we're about 7 years in. the things that SD-WAN traditionally does, it still does, right? It connects all of my corporate locations to whatever resources I need to connect them to, be it a data center or a cloud-hosted service. But we can also use that as an on-ramp to SASE functions. So my branch offices, they can route through the secure web gateway on their way to an internet-based destination. I don't need to hairpin them back through a data center and pick up that latency. Maybe I can downsize my corporate data center a little bit, get some cost savings there. On the remote user side, right, now they have, again, we'll start with the base service of the secure web gateway. That can be their firewall in the sky. And we can set their personal endpoints, maybe with a PAC file or a persistent client, that forces all their traffic up through that. So no matter where they're going, public cloud, SaaS, YouTube, it's going through the secure gateway. We can bring ZTNA into the mix, right? Which we'll talk about a little bit more about identity on the next slide. But look, this is zero-touch network access. It's really the core tenet of onboarding users or getting users into your network securely, because we have to decide that they can come in based on who they are, not because they're inside or outside a perimeter. Cloud Access Security Broker really focused on securing SaaS applications, right? Since I have no control over when endpoint goes to O365, if I want to apply security policy to that application, I need something that connects directly to that application via an API and allows me to apply email security policies, data loss prevention, right? O365 has got to be like the biggest source of corporate espionage that's ever been invented, because it's so easy to just download proprietary information. And it's so easy to do that from a non-corporate device. So kind of where does that take us, right? The framework, and not just the nuts and bolts, but the strategy around it. The big thing is we need to be able to provide a consistent policy and a consistent user experience regardless of the user's location. And we do that by making it identity-based, right? I don't care where you are. I care who you are. I care that we've decided you can have access to the thing that you're trying to access. I want to know where you are when you're doing it. I want to know when you're doing it, because if you're suddenly, trying to access resources at 3 o'clock in the morning when you don't typically do that, maybe that's a questionable event.
From India?
Yeah, from India, right? Geography matters.
Context matters, right? Who you are, where you are, what you're trying to get to. All
So-
of that can feed into that same platform around how you're going to develop security policy. Depending on who the user is, it all becomes focused on the identity-based identity. This whole system starts with identity.
So, I think a metaphor that I hear us use a lot is we need to make it so that we have a firewall for every single user. And I'd say that's kind of what SASE does and what identity-based security does, right? So I can create an identity policy that then persists with that user wherever they are. So it's contextually aware. Are they supposed to be able to do this? It's monitoring what that person is doing. And we can then apply application-specific rules around what they can do, what needs to be monitored, but it's uniform so that when they're sitting in the corporate office, they have a set of security policies. When they're sitting at home, they have a set of security policies, but those are the same. And I think if there's nothing else to take away about like what SASE does, that's probably the most important thing, is let's create a common set of security policies for your users based on who they are, regardless of where they are. So how do we unpack this? How do we get here? And maybe Kevin, if you want to start here.
Yeah, exactly. So how do we start? How does somebody move from a NaaS or an SD-WAN migration and start to build in those SASE items? Definitely, you have to buy all new stuff. I'm a salesperson. You have to buy all new things, SASE things, give me your shipping address and tell me how many units of SASE you'd like, and I'll
Right.
send you a pallet.
They're taking purchase over their orders over there on the
Well,
bench.
We have SASE. You have to. There's no way you can do this without throwing everything out and starting new, right? No, definitely not. The core principle here is identity. A lot of us have systems, especially if we're moving towards that cloud migration. We have systems that can start to do this already. You know, systems that maybe they haven't been turned on, they haven't been tapped. I have a lot of folks that have started with me and they've done it. They did an SD-WAN migration 3 years ago. And they did that SD-WAN migration when they had a corporate firewall at their data center that still had good life in it. And that firewall was working just fine, and the SD-WAN was a replacement of MPLS. They turned down really big, expensive, well, really small, expensive circuits. They're all 10 meg little MPLS circuits everywhere. They turned up broadband and SD-WAN, but the data flow is still the same. It got them back to the data center. As we start to move towards things like a cloud firewall, or we start to move off of some of those old legacy architectures, we get to a point where we can reevaluate where we put identity in the network, whether it's, you know, access control around wired or wireless connection, or connectivity to different applications. So it doesn't necessarily start with new things. It starts with framing network access around identity. So let's go ahead.
Yeah. So how does this fix your Starbucks problem? So you need to fix 3 things to fix the Starbucks problem, right? You need to secure that user's access to the public internet. You need to secure their access to SaaS applications, and you need to secure your access or their access into any internally hosted resources. Anyone want to comment on how we might do that with SASE? Take a shot. That doesn't work for an OEM. Fair enough. So look, we're going to use secure web gateways, right? That user, right, either with a pack file or something, you know, installed on their endpoint, is going to go have their outbound traffic go through firewall on the cloud. Before we even get to doing that, though, we'll have identified who they are based on ZTNA. We're using ZTNA with an IDP. So we know who they are and what they're supposed to get to. And if the profile for that user says they can access internal applications, they'll be permitted. And they will be permitted across essentially that VPN-like, well, it is under the transport is a VPN, but it will be transported across that VPN from their endpoint into the SASE/SD-WAN cloud back to the corporate data center. And all the way through that, what they're doing is being monitored and logged and potentially alerted on if something bad happens. So, Kevin, what is ZTNA? You've been a real engineer more recently than me, so let's.
That's a great question. Zero Trust Network Access, right, is what the industry acronym is. I've seen about a half a dozen OEMs and more than half a dozen salespeople all call it something different. Some people refer to it, they say, yeah, we have a ZTNA client. Well, that sounds an awful lot like a VPN client. That just means that you've got a, and if it looks like a duck and smells like a duck, I think it quacks like a duck. Like I see a lot of folks that use it, and what it really is, it's that combination of user, endpoint, and application. The endpoint matters too, right? Whether it's corporate or however, those 3 things. When you start to kind of pack that together, how you are accessing, how your users are accessing what. CBTS sometimes, like internally, we talk with a lot of clients that they come and they say, well, I already have this and I have that, and I kind of like what we go through is like this analysis process where we kind of talk about the services that you have today, what security bits and pieces you might have to address parts of this solution, and kind of we joke, we say we're going to create a Franken-SASE. You know, you've got some parts of the body, and we're going to kind of stitch the rest of it together and bring it to life, kind of Frankenstein's monster style. But really, the point is, it's because a lot of people have that, existing infrastructure, existing architecture that we need to design for, and then we need to, when we go through that evaluation of figuring out how do we create that security policy around users, devices, and applications, where do we find the missing pieces? We do that assessment or work through evaluations, and we figure out kind of where some of those gaps are, and we say, yeah, you've got services over here, Microsoft for a lot of folks, plenty of folks that have some Microsoft security services that maybe aren't turned on or maybe aren't tuned because your Microsoft team isn't the same as your security team, isn't the same as your network team, or maybe that's all one guy, and that one guy works in one bucket at a time or just has that experience around one set of services versus the other. We'll go through and kind of work to figure out where the gaps are, how we can fix those gaps with existing infrastructure, and then where maybe we can supplement or complement that with kind of other things that maybe need to be part of a security roadmap so that we can kind of cover that triangle of users, applications, and devices.
Thank you. So I think we'll skip the how does ZTNA fit into SASE. I think we kind of covered that with that answer. Couple other bullet points here because I want to make sure we have some Q&A time. Secure web gateway with this firewall as a service. You'll see these terms in OEM presentations. I'm not even sure I can explain the difference to you, and I do this for a living. They're very close, right? The secure web gateway will generally, with a lot of exceptions, mean it's essentially an outbound firewall, right? So end user branch location, outbound to the internet, it's going to do traffic inspection there. Sometimes they have silly things like it only looks at HTTPS, but it won't look at FTP traffic, but like we're splitting hairs, by the way. Firewall as a service tends to do a little bit more. So whatever features the OEM wants to charge you more for, go into firewall. I'm kidding, but not. But those are what goes into firewall as a service. It behaves more like you've taken an instance of Palo Alto or Checkpoint and you've just sat it on cloud compute rather than a SaaS-based security service. So it's more, if you get into looking at a OEM, just read the fine print there. And then, Kev, what happens to the wired and wireless LAN users here? Do they get a big change in experience, or do they just get left, on the old plumbing?
That's kind of the other part about the network optimization that maybe we haven't touched on as much, but because it's not just about, and I kind of mentioned it a little bit earlier, it's not just about security, it's about access and quality of experience too, to make sure that regardless of where those people or devices are, that they have an experience quality that we're able to monitor, manage, inspect. Because a lot of these conversations for us start there. They start with a Wi-Fi conversation more often than not. Folks that are going to retailers that they're going to a mobile POS and they say, I don't have wireless infrastructure in my stores, for a sales associate to be walking around with a handgun scanning devices. And I can't have them standing under the access point and waiting for customers to come up to them so that they can scan. Like, they need to be able to go out, wander around the store and transact sales wherever they are. Those kinds of mobile initiatives, which we certainly see tons of organizations going through, a lot of those are actually what we see driving this conversation around network optimization. And then once we start that conversation, we realize these gaps in security and gaps in user experience and endpoint experience. And we start to say, okay, so we need to design a new WAN flow for this application or this mobile device. What does that look like? And we start to recognize all these things that might be missing across that WAN infrastructure. And we say, whoa, hold on. Let's take a broader approach. We mentioned a couple names, that I've worked with recently. Both of those started as mobile initiatives. If you walk into Lids today, they have scanning guns in the mall. That started as a Wi-Fi customer experience initiative that turned into a complete security initiative. Same thing for Claire's. Not that any of you, Claire's.
I got my ears pierced.
Yeah, I bet you did.
Technician, when we were done, he was a very, I was on the phone with one of our very first texts, and he was very, the most dry technician I ever talked to me at the end. I said, all right, last thing you got to do then, if you can just go ahead and get your nose pierced and to verify that the scanning, that the piercing, and he was really quiet for a second. He goes, didn't say that statement. It's okay, take a breath. You don't have to. You didn't. But anyway, it starts with end user experience, right? And a lot of those we see actually kind of what drives the SASE story, because it's end-to-end experience, and then it also has to be end-to-end security on top of that. You can't leave those two out. They're very much the business, the executive level. A lot of those folks are featured or focused on their own customer base and what that customer experience might be like. But those customer experience initiatives usually can come with a security cost if you're not careful. So that's kind of what we see kind of driving a lot of these conversations here.
So does this sound like too much? Right? It's a lot of change. A lot of OEMs, a lot of different services, a whole lot of different skill sets, right? And it is, right? We have multiple teams internally that do this. And I can't say that any of us are 100% good at all of it, but that's why we, partner with different teams within the organization, he says he is. Look, we actually just had to combine, or we just combined our, networking team with our security team. And we put them all up under the same VP. They all have like common management structure now. And we did that because we have to be able to support this new world for our clients. And that is really us, like what us and ATC does together is, we learn customer needs. We kind of pick what the best, solution is. ATC might not pick us, but when they do, we'll pick, kind of the right OEM. But we're essentially here to make that easier, and we'll do kind of any flavor of consumption, whether you just want us to design, build, and hand it over, or if you want us to provide ongoing management and support. And kind of along with that is, we talk a lot about just needing network support, but, what's your plan for managed detection and response and kind of greater security operations center type services? All of these tools, they need to be watched. We need to watch for alerts. We need to tune what is important and not important. And we need to have a reaction plan that is in place 24 hours a day. Most organizations really aren't big enough to do that themselves, or at least to do it themselves well. It's very easy to just check a box on your cyber insurance saying we have a 24-hour alerting plan, but if that alerting plan is, it emails IT, it's not necessarily a great plan. So, all of this, that we can build, we can also put, essentially security as a service or security monitoring as a service type programs around it, and help manage that risk for you as well. And, thanks for coming, everybody. If there's questions, I don't know how much time we still have in this room, but right. So we have some questions here. If you don't want to, get up in front of the class, we do have a little table out there in the lobby.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah. Thank you.